From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal, here with Joe Sternberg and Kyle Peterson. Before we get into reparations, Joe Sternberg, do you have any other thoughts on the special counsel and the potential indictment of Donald Trump?
Well, I would only say that particularly on some of this documents, stuff that is factoring into this case, that ultimately does come down to the sort of issue of Donald Trump's judgment and character that is something that voters will end up having to settle one way or the other. Which is why, one of the things that's been very disappointing to me over the past couple of years is that the Congress itself has failed to really come up with a convincing way of investigating so many of these issues. Certainly we thought of this mainly through the lens of the January 6th hearings, which did a certain amount of yeoman's work in terms of bringing new details about what had happened surrounding January 6th to light. But, unfortunately, Democrats in Congress really botched the politics of that in terms of the staging of some of those hearings and decisions that they made about which Republicans they would or would not allow to serve on the committee. That meant that we missed that opportunity to try to settle some of these issues about Donald Trump's character or fitness for office. And that, I think, is really why now people feel like we're playing catch up on the prosecutorial front. And it would have been so much better if we could have come up with a way of doing this through a democratic or legislative process instead of a prosecution.
All right, let's turn to the COP27 climate conference, a global annual conference. John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, had said only a couple of weeks ago that there was no way that there was going to be any payment by the United States or European countries to climate reparations, so-called, for poor countries. But in the end, the U.S. signed up for the fund at the last minute. Joe, what happened?
Well, I think that there was probably just a certain amount of desperation to get any kind of deal done so that all of these hundreds of delegates who had converged on Egypt would have something to show for themselves over the past couple of weeks. And this happened to be the thing that had a critical mass behind it because, you can't blame 100 plus developing countries for hopping on board the train if they think there's going to be an opportunity to get money out of developed countries. Now, I will say, and this might surprise you and Kyle, Paul, there is kind of vaguely the kernel of a good idea in this fund insofar as the argument has always been that, if you believe, as I think many of us do, that the climate is changing, but you have a lot of questions about the ability of net zero or carbon restrictions to affect that change, the smart thing to do is to spend money on mitigation. And if that had kind of been what this fund was supposed to be about, then it might actually have been a sign of progress from this summit. But instead, what you're going to end up with is this classic situation where, although we don't know how much money they're going to pour into this fund, who is going to contribute to the fund, how it's going to be dispersed, you can be very certain that it's probably going to be done clumsily, that there will inevitably be enormous amounts of corruption involved in it. And the one thing that the money will probably not be spent on are things like installing air conditioning units or, shoring up dams and levees to try to control any flooding that might start happening in coastal regions. And on top of that, developed countries are still also going to be spending astronomical amounts of money chasing their tails, trying to limit the amount of carbon that they're emitting. And so I think it is just another very expensive climate policy disaster in the making.
Well, this new fund, the details of which are not laid out, they're going to be developed by a committee of the COP nations over the course of the next year, amounts, commitments, etc. But this is in addition to the $100 billion that the Obama administration had committed going back to the Paris meeting of climate countries for adaptation and transition in poor countries to renewable fuels. So you already have that commitment, and now you're making this new one, and the administration has signed up for it without, obviously, any approval by Congress, much less any appropriation of money from Congress. And I find this whole idea that you have executive branch officials trooping around the world, making commitments upon U.S. taxpayers with other global elites, deeply offensive to our constitutional framework. And then they come back and say, well, geez, we have to now appropriate money for this because we've already committed it. Well, you committed it, but we didn't. The public didn't. The Congress didn't. And so, this kind of thing is highly, I think, problematic just from an American political point of view, Kyle.
And it's highly problematic, I think, also just from a energy reality point of view. I'll just look at the numbers from the Energy Information Administration. This is 2021 U.S. primary energy consumption. 36% petroleum, 32% natural gas, 11% coal, 8 nuclear power, and 12 renewable energy. And so even in the United States, the most developed country that is farthest along in the energy transition that everyone says is coming, we're still talking about 12% renewable energy. The unspoken issue at a lot of these conferences, which I frankly don't understand, is nuclear power. We're not having a $100 billion fund to build out nuclear power everywhere. But it seems to me that a lot of these arguments are misplaced because we're still going to be relying on fossil fuels for a long time. And if we really wanted to help a lot of these countries, we would spend that money and send our expertise over there and help them get a local fracking industry up and going. There's demand for natural gas, not least among our allies in Europe who are facing a cold winter here as their Russian supplier gets cut off after the Ukraine invasion. And it's great. It would help them industrialize. And instead, we are sort of still arguing that in 5 years, 2030, I think President Biden has some targets. We're going to be all windmills everywhere. And I just don't think that it's reality.
There's just a kind of, Joe, I'm going to give you the last word, kind of inertial momentum with these things. They just have to keep the climateers, because climate and the belief that somehow humans can stop the changes in the climate, that they must keep moving upward and do more and more and more, making more commitments, even if they haven't met the previous commitments. China being, of course, the case in point. It said, we're not going to do anything on climate until 2030. And then, boy, we'll be all in. Well, thanks very much, gents. In the meantime, it's developing more coal plants, new coal plants, by 2025 than all the coal plants that currently exist, the current fleet in the United States. So much of this is just gesture politics without real consequence.
This might be overly optimistic or Pollyannish of me, but I'm hoping that we're going to end up looking back at last year's COP in Glasgow in the United Kingdom as the high watermark for these conferences. It is kind of noticeable about this year's conference. They all showed up thinking that they were going to accomplish quite a lot, and what they've been able to agree on is this reparations fund where they haven't actually been able to agree on any of the details. And you can still do an enormous amount of mischief that way over the longer term. And so I don't want to downplay what a serious problem this thing is going to become if it ever manages to get off the ground. But it also is pale shadow of things like, I remember last year you had the UK coming out with a big new net zero strategy and a commitment for that, and a lot of excitement about how we were going to achieve all of these climate goals from that summit. And what's happened over the past year is a new sense of realism about the energy sources that people actually need, especially now that natural gas from Russia is not available in Europe. I think that there is a new growing sense of realism about the implications for some of these climate policies on economic growth and prosperity, especially in the developing world. So, the good news spin on this is that if we end up getting dragged into a debate about mitigation measures as an alternative to spending money on all of the windmills and solar panels, that might end up being a good thing over the medium term. But clearly, there's still a lot of fight in them for the global climate elite who have built careers out of pushing for the windmills and solar panels, and they're not going to go out without a fight.
And your energy prices are going up, inevitably, as they continue to move on this. All right. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kyle. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back tomorrow and the rest of the week, except for Thanksgiving Day, with more editions of Potomac Watch. Thanks for listening.